I first start with the corner brackets. This process starts by marking where to drill the holes for the bolts that will eventually hold the corner brackets in place. I line the bracket to be in the middle of the board and then trace the holes with my pencil. I then proceed to drill a pilot hole because hogging out all that waste in one pass is a recipe for disaster. Even with the pilot hole, we still get a good bit of tear out from the 3/8 inch bit. To alleviate tear out from the bigger bit, I found that easing into the speed and cutting the top part of the board's fibers first and then finishing up helps a ton. You will get tear out on the bottom if you don't clamp down a sacrificial board. However, I decided to opt out doing this as it is hidden under the table, which no one will see unless you have some crazy woodworker who likes to look under furniture just to see how it was made. Like myself? No one really will ever see the tear out on the top because it's hidden by the bracket, but you must make sure you remove it as the bracket will have to fit flush with the wood, and with the fibers there, you will not get that to happen. After marking and drilling all the holes for the corner brackets, I move on to fetching the wood for the top. Now I have a stockpile of lumber cut from when my brother-in-law cleared out about 15 acres from his place, so a couple weeks ago I went up there and pulled some white oak from the drying piles. The moisture meter said that it was about 10%, which I thought was close enough to the 8% rule, but you will see why that is a rule later. I start out by cross-cutting the live edge pieces 2 inches over final dimension. It's a good rule to cut and mill your boards a bit bigger than final dimension, then let them acclimate to your shop's moisture. If the boards have moved at all in any fashion, it's easier to deal with when you've got some room for remilling. As for dimensions, I'm measuring what the old Tops boards were and using that as a guide for length. For the width, I opted for a 1/2 inch overhang on both sides of the frame. However, looking back, I should have went with at least an inch if not 2 inches of overhang. As for thickness, I chose to go with the thickest I could given the boards that I had, which turned out to be about an inch thick. I wanted this cart to feel beefy and remain super heavy as to keep that "they don't build them like they used to" perspective when someone tries to move it to inspect the quality. This is what I feel is lacking in the mass production furniture making companies. A feel of durability and quality, which is why I started making furniture for myself in the first place. Now since these boards have a live edge, I go through the normal process of finding the best parts of the board and mill the live edge right off. Just a note on safety here, you never want to cut a non-flat board on the table saw. This is because if the board is either twisted or cupped in any fashion, the board could get wedged between the fence and could cause the famed kickback problem. So always start the cutting at the bandsaw. After the boards have been milled to 4 square and have been sitting on the stickers from my shop for a few days, I go directly to cutting to final dimensions. I decided to mimic the original design, which I think was just taking whatever stock they had on hand and nailing it to the top. My reasoning here is that none of the boards on the top from the original were the same width. Some were wider and some were more narrow. So all I did was take enough off the boards that I milled to fit the frame. No real science or design here, just kind of make it fit mentality. Now before I put the top on the frame, I decided to do some light sanding. This is so that I don't have any difficulty when sanding underneath the overhang from the top. Okay, now it's time for a dry fit to see how the top will look when added to the frame. Piece by piece I add one after the other until the top is completely done. Now doesn't that look nice? I needed to notch out the 2 end pieces to allow the corner brackets to have clearance, so back to the bandsaw. Once all the notches are done, I start aligning the first top end piece and start nailing them in place. I decided once again to stick to the original design, and against my experience, I opted for no gluing of the joints, just some good old nails. I don't show it here, but the first piece is a pretty important step. as this is not like a normal tabletop glue-up where we first glue it all up and then put it on. So if you want your boards to align and be straight down the frame with the right overhang on both sides, you need to establish a good starting point. Once you get that first board right where it's supposed to be, then all that's left is putting the next board in front of each other and nailing it down. I suggest using quick clamps to hold your pieces down, as when you start to hammer hard, your board will move pretty good if not secure. And I found out this the hard way. Just 2 quick clamps are good enough to hold it down and get it nailed in without it moving very much. Like I said earlier, once the first board is set, then all it is just nailing down the others in place. It's as simple as that, unless you're particular about symmetry like I am. I like it when all the nails match up and look like an old Howard Hughes airplane that's just been assembled with about 1,000,000 rivets and looks absolutely beautiful. I think that kind of even flow is very aesthetically pleasing to someone looking at it. It's sort of like when a picture frame isn't level, no matter how much it's off, it still gives that figurative punch in the face. I have to force myself not to fix it when it's not my own. Once I have the lines drawn and the drilling mark set, I align the board, then clamp it down and drill the holes for the nails. I had to mark where the nails would go on the ends of the cart, so I whipped out my handy dandy square and drew a line to mark the depth from the edge to place the nail right in the middle of the underlying frame. Then it was just making sure the nails matched the opposite ends nails. After the boards were all marked, I just drew and nailed, and then rinse and repeat. Once the top is completely assembled, we start with sanding to prep it for its first stage of finish. I had to break out the card scraper to help with the spots around the knots on the top, as the grain was going every which way. Next on the list is to break the sharp edges, as we don't want the edges to be a hazard. I think a small 45-degree chamfer is very pleasing to the eye, and for this I always grab my reliable low-angle block plane, which works great for the chamfer and not causing tear out where the end grain meets the long grain. Well, that wraps up this section of the Lineberry Cart Coffee Table project. We'll continue next with drilling the holes for the rest of the hardware after a special coat of finish. And, as always, support your local woodworker.